Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to continue to discuss the U.S. elections. We're going to take another aspect to this because there's a lot of chatter now about Donald Trump possibly pardoning himself. Now, is that even possible? There seems to be some debate about that within lawyers and those who are law experts in the United States vis-a-vis what the Constitution may or may not say about that. But nevertheless, I mean, we know that Donald Trump has a lot of cases against him at this point in time, vis-a-vis his taxes and a whole host of other issues as well. Will he, should he, pardon himself at this point in time before he leaves office? I mean, to many people, it would make logical sense that if he can do it legitimately, that he do so. However, of course, one of the important points to make here and what discrepancies that exist is that he can only pardon himself, according to the Constitution, for federal crimes, not for state-level crimes. So those cases would still very much go ahead, and if he were to leave office, he would still need to very much answer for those if he is, of course, found guilty of any of those respective cases and crimes. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Barbara Benitez, who is an assistant professor at the George Washington University. She's also a journalist, and she's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Barbara, thank you very much for joining us. What do you make of this chatter about Donald Trump possibly pardoning himself? It's certainly not beyond him. I mean, he's full of surprises, but do you think, A, it'll happen, and what are your thoughts about it overall?
Well, as you mentioned, it's been going on for a while. There is talk that since 2017, he was starting to hint around at what the possibilities were for him to be able to pardon himself. Nobody took him seriously at the time because he obviously had time into his presidency. And then at the time, I'm sure his advisors, as well as himself, had hoped that he would then indeed win the 2020 election. Can he pardon himself? As you mentioned in your introduction, it is something that legal experts are discussing. Has it been done before? Absolutely not. No president in U.S. history has ever used or tried to self-pardon themselves. Back when Nixon and the whole Nixon scandal resignation following the impeachment for his role in the Watergate scandal, it was discussed, and a 1974 Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel, a memo came out stating that under the fundamental rule, no one may be able to judge in their own case. So the president then cannot pardon himself. Of course, under the Justice Department then versus who we have now is a different story. Legal experts say he cannot, but again, it's never been done.
What does this say then, do you think, about Donald Trump, the man, as well as, the Trump organization as a whole? That, even in office, he has had so many cases filed against him just in the past 4 years, and of course, before that as well.
I mean, for a president, a sitting president, to not want to resign at this point in the election, with the results looking likely that President-elect Biden is indeed the next U.S. president, for him to behave this way is not something that's usual, number one. So putting that out there first and foremost. And I think as days go by, his behavior, it only denigrates himself further, if that's even possible. It's embarrassing, as President-elect Biden mentioned. It's being seen in Washington circles as a danger to national security, particularly with his recent Pentagon firings. However, when we go back to the issue of the pardoning himself, the one thing that he being considered possibly is if he then resigned and allowed the U.S. Vice President Pence to take over for a very small amount of time and pardon him. That might be the only way that we get close to any form of a concession. But so far, he seems adamant that, there's been electoral fraud and that he still is indeed the president. Whether that's for his ego, many insiders believe it is. that, his handlers are just trying to help him through this transition phase to get to a point where he's used to the fact that he will not be president after January 20th. I actually saw a tweet from a right-wing Geraldo Rivera. He's a well-known journalist in like Fox News and so on and so forth. And he had said that he had a discussion with Trump and that Trump is slowly resigning himself. But does that mean he's going to concede? That's quite another story.
I wonder whether or not these cases go through, whether or not he pardons himself or not. Just the fact that this chatter is now in the air and has been for a while now. This sets precedents, does it not, for future occupants of the White House as well, right? Because in the future, someone may very well come into the White House and say, "Oh, I want to take advantage of the situation. If I am able to pardon myself, why not?" What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right. Everything he's doing is setting a negative precedent. If he did have the opportunity to pardon himself, I have no doubt that others down the road would then follow suit. One thing to note, though, even if such a scenario played out and he were to be able to pardon himself, it only applies to federal crimes. And as you noted, in the state of New York, there are charges pending against him for allegations of tax fraud, among other things, bad business practices for the Trump organization itself. Those he cannot escape. And, the people trying to get these charges to stick are rather adamant that they will indeed do so this time.
So then let's talk politics then here, right? Because there's a number of things that we've seen ever since Donald Trump has come into office. So we had that entire Russia collusion case against him that didn't really get anywhere in the sense that it wasn't proven in the court of law that that there was proper collusion, at least from my reading of it. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But back then, as you had noted as well in your earlier answer, his team had already said, and this was in 2017, that he would, if he were found guilty of crimes, would pardon himself or would possibly look into that option. The politics of all this, how does this then play into the continuing polarization, left versus right, all of the above? Does this mean that, for example, this sort of thing, i.e. pardoning themselves or crimes committed while in office, are beyond, for example, a Democrat?
They absolutely would not be beyond any sitting president if they're indeed allowed to go through, or even, as I mentioned earlier, if he were to resign and allow Vice President Pence to take over briefly and pardon him, which probably would be the only way, to be honest, that such a pardon would be allowed, especially for that federal crime. I know that's something that has been sticking with him since, as I mentioned, 2017, when he first started discussing federal pardons, if he'd be able to have that. Yeah, I think, as you said, it opens the door. Whether a president is on either side of the aisle, they would then indeed be able to do that. Will it help with the situation of polarization? I think that's going to take a while. In my honest opinion, and again, this is just opinion here, I feel like that percentage, like the Republican Party that's looking at the numbers, how many people had voted for Donald Trump in this election, I believe it's somewhere in the 70 million plus. That's his base. But of that amount of people, I'm sure we're going to see fall off as time goes on. 4 years might not seem like a long time, but it is. Another interesting note, Saturday, today, actually, they're supposed to have this big rally. We'll see what the turnout for that is. Are his numbers falling off? Are people starting to move on and just get over it? I think he'll always have a little bit of a core base, and I think they'll always exist. Polarization, especially when you have a two-party system.
And, well, we'll have to leave there's a final word, Barbara, but we do sincerely appreciate you spending your Saturday morning for us and speaking to us and sharing your insight with us. That was Barbara Benitez speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C., sharing our expertise on this case of whether or not Trump can actually pardon himself. Of course, there is a huge debate about that amongst legal experts and especially constitutional experts within the United States. Whether or not it happens or not, it's beyond, this discussion and this debate because we're not experts on that. But it just creates a precedent, right, where other presidents that possibly afterwards can also then talk about this and also look into this. Because if there is this sort of confusion on it, then somebody's bound to take Viewers are still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss Germany. And we've been talking about the issue of the far right and far right extremism in that country, as well as, of course, across Europe and much of the Western world also. But in Germany, this has been an issue for a while now, especially since, the synagogue attack in Halle not too long ago. Germany has now charged 12 people in a terror plot. And that terror plot this investigation has been going on for a while now. So we did have a show about this earlier also. Suspects have been accused of essentially creating an organization, a terrorist organization, essentially, of planning attacks on politicians, asylum seekers, and even Muslims in order to try to, spark a civil war. And this is very similar, again, what has happened in the United States, right, where the Boogaloo movement, as we've heard about there, has also sought to spark a civil war of some sort in order to create that sort of uncertainty and unrest to be able to then achieve whatever goals it is that they are seeking to achieve through their such actions. Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Dr. Carmen Aguilera-Carnerero, who is a lecturer at the University of Granada. She's also Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right and is a researcher with the Bridge Initiative of the University of Georgetown. She's joining us today from Granada in Spain. Carmen, thank you very much for joining us. Let's firstly talk about Germany if we can, and Europe, really. This has been an issue for a while now, right? The rise of the right, but governments have been slow to react. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I mean, the threat of the rise of the violence and the terrorist attack by the far right has been a problem in the Western world for a long time now. Governments know, scholars, experts have been working on this area for a long time now, and they have already warned about the problem, the potential threat that this might be in the civil society, in society in general. But I think that actually, as you said, the governments are slow to react, probably because they didn't consider the threat as a real potential danger. But now you can see that the situation is proven exactly the opposite.
And it's interesting because this is at first, there was conversation, I know, early on that this may be a reaction to what's being termed as quote unquote Islamic or Islamist terrorism, but it doesn't seem as simple as that, right? This has affected everybody. We had these synagogue attacks. So this is also including not just Islamophobia, but also anti-Semitism, anti-migrant feelings. Why are these groups even finding support, do you think? What kind of ideology are they being able to tap into that they're finding this sort of support?
I think, as you said, actually, obviously, there is a very clear target in most of these groups, which are Muslims, and the attacks are against Muslims. But also, as you also said, any minorities and the threat is under attack. And also members of non-belonging, members who don't belong to any of these groups are also potential targets. So I think it's actually, obviously, there is an ideology, or at least there was an ideology behind these groups, supporting and as the seed of these attacks and this kind of violence. But I think now maybe it's extending and spreading the target, and everybody's under potential threat. I don't think that most of the population are aware that everybody is a potential threat. The fact that you're not a Muslim or you are not a Jew doesn't mean that you're not going to be potentially a target for these groups, because violence is extending and spreading and normalized in such a way that everybody is a potential target. In relation to who supports these groups, I think that, as you said also, the phenomenon is beyond Islamophobia, even though Islamophobia is at the core center in most of the ideology of these terrorist groups, but is much more complex than this. And they receive support of many sides who have interest in some or other way in this kind of violence and attacks.
I wonder, what are your thoughts about politicians and their role in all this, right? It's easy to pick on Donald Trump, but Donald Trump has also said many, many things which I would think would support a more right ideology. But then it's not like it's only him, right? We've also had many politicians in Italy, for example. We had Salvini, and we've had Viktor Orban in Hungary. We can probably make a huge list of such names of people who have made very, very disturbing, many times, comments, very far right comments. Does that play a huge part in all this, do you think?
I totally think so. I mean, in the center of the analysis of the radical right, there are experts all worldwide working on particular countries, particular political figures, and denouncing, claiming, and reporting through their very serious analysis, scholar analysis, how the potential threat of these politicians, the discourse, the political discourse, this kind of extreme violent discourse of politicians tend to spread on a daily basis through these media, social media, mainstream media. They become part, they drip into the population, they suck the population to the point that it becomes part of the normalized discourse, so that the average citizen is unable to distinguish which is extreme that from what is not extreme. And everybody, as you said, mentioned Trump as the epitome of the far right, or this kind of extreme politics or ideology. But it's true that we have seen plenty of examples, as you mentioned, some of them: Italy, Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and now spreading in South America somehow. In Europe, we have a big problem with this. And the far right is, it's a tendency, this kind of violent, divisive polarization of the discourse is spreading. It's on the rise in the last years. So definitely, I think, obviously, politicians have a responsibility in the creation of this climate on the population, but definitely the far right politicians that you mentioned are definitely very responsible of this kind of behavior in the average population, with the discourse and the promotion of this kind of ideology and behavior that seems to be normalized, or what they look up to.
Yeah. So what situation where you are in Spain then, Carmen? Is this a concern there as well?
No, I don't think. That doesn't mean that we obviously have organizations, associations, groups that spread this kind of, they have this kind of ideology, but fortunately, for now, they are a very minoritarian sector of society. They don't even have representation, political representation in the parliament of the Congress, so they don't represent a threat to the population in general. That doesn't mean that, for instance, when there is a terrorist attack, obviously, for instance, mosques are attacked, vandalized, and there are a lot of, sector of the Muslim population who are attacked and under threat. But even though there's obviously a lot of problems, we have to improve a lot of things in Spain and Spanish society. I think right now we cannot compare the situation of Spain with, for instance, the situation of violence or that you have in Germany or in Austria or in other countries in Europe.
As a final comment then, Carmen, before I let you go, let's talk about solutions then. What needs to happen, do you think, in your expert opinion? What do governments in Europe, for example, need to do to be able to properly tackle this? It's one thing to, of course, and it's important to certainly have court cases. It's important to label such plots terrorist plots. All those labels are extremely important too, which we know for a very long time media and politicians have avoided doing. But it certainly needs to go beyond that, right? I imagine this goes into education and a whole bunch of other such factors.
Yeah, I think there's a confluence, as you said, of many factors. A lot of factors should be involved in society to tackle this problem. As a lecturer, as a teacher, I should say, and I always say that this is what I said in the European Parliament in January, education is a key factor. Why? Because only if you educate the citizens of the future, they will be able to discriminate, for instance, fake news of the kind of discourse that is divisive and polarizing. So education is a key factor, but also not only, as you said, politicians, first of all, should be aware, should admit the problem, and then issue the legislation against it. And because otherwise, first of all, if you don't admit there is a problem and you don't consider it as a real threat, you will do nothing on it. And definitely they should legislate against this kind of violence that, as I said, is on the rise and becomes a real threat and a real problem for, any society.
Indeed. We'll leave it there at that, Carmen, but we sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your Saturday afternoon to speak with us here in Scope. That was Carmen Aguilera-Carnerero speaking to us from Granada in Spain, sharing our expert insight on this plot in Germany, 12 people being charged there for a far-right terror plot, possibly to attack Muslims, politicians, and asylum seekers seeking to spark a civil war. As I said, very similar to the Boogaloo movement in the United States. How much of a role do politicians, media, how much of a role does education have in all of this? And how much of a role will that then have, and all of the above have, going forward in trying to resolve the situation of the far right? It seems yet that even now, with all the attacks that we've had by the far right, even in places like Christchurch, and there's a whole long list of such attacks also even after Christchurch, that even now governments are still very skeptical to name this terrorism, to go after this in a very, very tough fashion. And that is, of course, still problematic at this time. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Australia and the issue of the war crimes investigation that is continuing and has been continuing for a while now. We've discussed this a number of times on this show, but at this point in time, we've also now had the Prime Minister who's come out and said that once a redacted report is released, it will make for very tough reading for Australians as well. There's talk of this report giving certain details about the killing of a 60-year-old child in a house raid in Afghanistan, as well as the killing of a prisoner being shot because there wasn't enough space on a helicopter. These all, of course, are very harrowing accounts of what may have happened in Afghanistan at the hands of elite Australian special forces who were sent there after 9/11 to take part in, of course, the operations led by the United States. Is Australia well placed to hold these men/women to account if they are guilty? What does this mean also for Afghanistan itself? Because, that's the one thing I think which is probably missing in this entire conversation, is that the effect on innocent Afghans of all of these sorts of crimes, not just committed by Australians, but possibly the hands of other countries' forces as well during these respective operations. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Joseph Anthony Camilleri, who is an emeritus professor at La Trobe University. He's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He's joining us today from Melbourne. Joining us from Kabul is Dr. Victoria C. Fontan, who is a professor of peace and conflict studies at the American University of Afghanistan. Victoria and Joseph, thank you both for your time today. Joseph, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the allegations as they've been laid out?
Well, these allegations are really contained in a report which was commissioned by the Australian Defence Force and the Australian Defence Force chief, to whom the report has gone, and is the result of investigations by Australian media, newspaper and the Australian Broadcasting Service, excuse me. And so this has been brewing now for some time, and we've been hearing all these reports. Now there is an official report, and that has gone to the Prime Minister. And the report will be released to the public, but in obviously a somewhat redacted form, which means some of the more crucial bits will remain confidential and at this point not open to the public. Excuse me. But the Prime Minister has made it clear that these will be investigated, and prosecutions may well take place. Yeah. And he has admitted to the Australian public that what's contained in the report, which is now with the government, does not represent something that the Australian public will be pleased to hear. It is obviously quite horrendous in its implications.
Victoria, tell us about what your thoughts are sitting there in Kabul, because again, as I said in my introduction, I think the one part that it remains missing in many of such conversations is the fact that we don't know, at least at this point in time, the names and identities of those who have been affected at the hands of these possible war crimes, be it by Australian forces or others. how does this affect what happens on the ground in Afghanistan? Because, it's also important to highlight that Afghan lives really matter, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is the most important element of what is happening at the moment. From the perspective of many here, this is Australia's Abu Ghraib moment. This is a moment where finally the lives of Afghans will indeed matter. And the hope here is that that Brereton report that is being released next week is going to open the way for other investigations to take place as well. And we know very much that the United States, of course, is at the moment the target of an investigation also by the International Criminal Court. So, for many of my students here, this is really a moment of justice, a moment of accountability, and a moment of hope. And we've been hearing about those human rights alleged abuses for a long time. I have students who write me journal entries on, such cases. And so here it's an open secret. And for the first time, that open secret is being taken seriously. And I really do hope that it is going to have ripple effects across the world.
Joseph, it's interesting that now the Prime Minister's come out and said, we will hold all these men/women to account, regardless of who they may be, and they're of course part of the elite commandos or were. But it's not like the government went into this very wittingly, right? I mean, as you well know, Joseph, there was that entire investigation of ABC journalists and the fact that they even, they're the whistleblower who gave them information regarding these allegations. Again, it seemed that there was more concentration on that, less on, actually dealing with this and the allegations in and of themselves. Is that a fair statement for me to make?
I think whenever such allegations are made, governments tend to be a little bit on the defensive, and that may well have applied in this case. But we ought to say that nevertheless, the Australian Defence Force at the highest level, once these allegations began to surface in the Australian media, were nevertheless willing to establish a very substantial, thoroughgoing and prolonged investigation. And clearly the report that's now been handed to the government is the result of that detailed investigation. There is one other thing, however, which needs to be said about this. In the end, the Australian government had no option but to take very seriously the situation, and for one particular reason, other than Australia wants, of course, to project an image of being able to engage in military activity, but always to do it on the right side of international law. But the key factor here, one of the key factors, is that Australia, of course, has signed and ratified the Rome Treaty, which it makes it amenable to action by the International Criminal Court. And clearly, if one reads very carefully the words of the Australian Prime Minister, he was making it clear that Australia is very keen that its own legal processes should deal with this matter, because it understands that if it were not able to do this to the satisfaction of the international community, there is a very real danger, which would be too awful to contemplate, that Australia could be then subject to investigation by the International Criminal Court. So that tells us something, I think, about the extraordinary importance of the International Criminal Court in these cases, particularly when the alleged misconduct is by the forces of a country that is a party to the statute, the treaty that established the International Criminal Court. And that, I hope, is something that other countries that have yet to sign and ratify the treaty establishing the court will take notice of that, because Australia, of course, is not the only one. There are many, many other countries which engage in international actions of one kind or another, and who no doubt are involved in such kind of conduct, whether it is a minute minority or more. Nevertheless, that is the problem with international military expeditions of this kind.
Indeed, and that final point, Victoria, I mean, this is something that happens, unfortunately, right, in such military activities, especially abroad, of course. What kind of an effect do you believe, not just, of course, specifically talking about Australia, but just overall coalition actions have had on Afghans themselves? I mean, I keep going back to that because I feel like that's the narrative that's not being spoken of enough. I mean, how does that affect the trust or lack of that Afghans have in the international community? And secondly, what kind of an effect this has on peace or conversations about peace going forward?
Well, this has a tremendously bad effect, obviously, because, I'm sitting here in Kabul. And, as you know, Kabul University and my own university has been the target of attacks recently and 4 years ago from my university. And many people in Kabul don't understand why, our institutions that represent, the international community and that represent a different way of thinking, why our institutions would be targeted. But when you see what happens in the provinces and the culture of recklessness, elitism and impunity that is being carried by those troops and those forces, killing Afghans day in, day out. Of course, one begs the question of this divide and this distrust between one part of the Afghan population at the receiving end of international war crimes and another part of the Afghan population that does not necessarily see that every day. And of course, this has an impact on any talks of peace in Afghanistan because, the reality is not being understood and the voice of victims is not being listened to. And so this is why, this investigation and hopefully the criminal investigation that will take place as a result of this administrative inquiry. This is why it's so important, because we need to bridge this gap and we need for the whole of Afghanistan to realize that victims are everywhere and that there is not just one side that deserves, to suffer more than another.
Indeed. Joseph, I haven't seen those details yet, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I haven't seen too much of an official Afghan involvement in this investigation. Do you believe that that should occur, that there should almost be a partnership investigation of some sort after this initial inquiry is over, of course? Because, again, as I said in my introduction, and as I said to Victoria as well, that their voices, as in the Afghan voice, is extremely important because it's them who are at the receiving end of if these are proven to be these crimes.
My understanding is that the investigation which has been going on and has been completed did in fact involve senior officers going to Afghanistan, Kabul for sure, but I think beyond that, and interviewing a number of people. And were given, as I understand it, in some of these meetings and interviews, graphic details of what was, in the view of some, their experience of and understanding of what had happened. So, I think this has happened. And of course, there will need to be more of that, especially if prosecutions were to occur. But if I may, I think there's one other thing we need to draw a conclusion we need to draw from this experience, and that is whenever international forces become engaged in offensive operations as opposed to just purely a UN peacekeeping operation, this is the danger that one runs. That some groups within the military will exceed the rules by which they're supposed to conduct themselves and violate them. And that is really one added reason why such external expeditions, external interventions into very volatile parts of the world, regions of the world, which are conflict prone, should be avoided at all costs. This was true of Iraq, true of Afghanistan, true of Syria, Libya, and many other places. This is something which the international community must learn to avoid at all costs. There are better ways of handling these complex conflicts than sending forces overseas by foreign powers.
Do that, Victoria, because that seems to be a fairly important lesson to be learned here, isn't it?
I absolutely agree. I couldn't have put it in a better way. And I really think that, the taxpayers and the public must understand that there is no clean war, and that unless the UN Security Council is actually sending peacekeeping troops under Chapter 7 or 6 of the UN Charter, this type of action and alleged human rights abuse will take place, because armed forces are trained to kill. They are not trained to actually maintain peace or take good care of the population. Winning hearts and minds can only be achieved under United Nations.
Indeed. Joseph, the whole point of going to Afghanistan after 9/11 was, of course, the fact that the 9/11 attacks in and of themselves were horrendous attacks in which a lot of innocents were killed. But do you think that, and I'm looking at the macro issue now, not just Australia, but do you think that the world has become safer through the involvement in Afghanistan and then Iraq, etc.?
Oh, it has become much, much more dangerous than it was. Because, to begin with, the intervention in Afghanistan, and for that matter, the intervention in Iraq, has not solved the terrorist problem. On the contrary, there are more lives being lost on an average per year now through terrorist attacks of one kind or another in different parts of the world than they were prior to September 11, 2001. So this is, I think, the lesson to be learned, that, yes, terrorism is a major problem, but there are other more effective ways of handling it. And at all times, it should be under the auspices of the United Nations if there is to be any action which involves military personnel. But apart from that, I think once you get into a conflict situation like Afghanistan or Iraq, there are so many other factors that become integrated into the equation. So there are other countries then that begin to think they have interests which they need to defend. It might be, if we're thinking Afghanistan, it might be some other neighboring countries. If you're thinking Iraq, it might be neighboring countries in the Middle East and indeed outside of the region, including the likes of other great powers. So once involvement takes place on a military scale by external forces which are not operating under the auspices of the United Nations, then there is the very serious danger, not only that your objective will not be achieved, that peace will not be easily restored, that not only that this enormous devastation and destruction will be inflicted in the area, but that other interests, external and domestic interests, will come into play and make the conflict in question even more intractable than it was to begin with. And unfortunately, the likes of Afghanistan and Iraq, the people of those countries, are the victims who have suffered enormously and continue to suffer to this day.
I'll give you the final word. On this topic of lessons to be learned, right? Do you think that what you're seeing right now happen on the ground in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the coalition? The peace talks are, of course, important as well, but do you think that those who got involved, the external powers that got involved, mainly the coalition, do you think that they've learned the lessons that needed to be learned about the many mistakes that were made in this process?
Unfortunately, conflict after conflict, lessons are seldom learned, and I'm afraid that there will be another Afghanistan elsewhere. And as my colleague rightfully said earlier, the fact that those human rights abuses are being investigated right now, and that an office of the special investigator has actually been created, is only in reaction to compelling evidence that could no longer be suppressed. We're talking about 55 separate incidents of the most gruesome nature that could be suppressed. So, from that perspective, it's very clear that lessons haven't been learned from Iraq, from Libya, from Syria, and other places, and that next time, maybe armed forces will be a little more careful. I really don't think from any of this. I do hope that the media will continue to concentrate on the centers of the fact.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Victoria and Joseph for their time today and for their expert insight. Victoria, they're speaking to us from Kabul, and Joseph was speaking to us this evening from Melbourne, shedding light on this issue of, how Australia has now finally appointed a special prosecutor, war crimes prosecutor, to investigate its own elite forces and their actions in Afghanistan. As Victoria was saying right at the end, 55 separate incidents, and each single one of these incidents, the details of which are extremely harrowing, need to be investigated, and those who have committed any such crimes need to be held to account, to the fullest extent of the law. Because, as Joseph there also mentioned, Australia is very much part of the Rome Statute. It needs to answer for these crimes internationally as well. And if it's not able to carry out a proper investigation, it may very well be referred to then international courts and international investigators to then get involved. Australia, though, did not go into this wittingly, did it? It did try to suppress the information. It did even go after journalists and carried out years-long investigations into journalists who dared to release this information, this whistleblower information about this. Was that even the right way to go about this, instead of actually looking into the allegations themselves and seeing if there was any evidence altogether? Now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, as our guest there said, they have no choice but to hold to account their own elite forces. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.